Hi, this is Dan Heisman. We're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better. In this video, we're going to do our fourth in our series of amateur games. If you're one of those people that says, oh, I can't learn anything from amateur games, I don't believe in that. I think that watching what other amateurs do, especially amateurs who are pretty good, like the two players in this game, and seeing where their small mistakes are, trying to avoid those mistakes and learning how to take advantage of them is really important. I completely agree that studying a lot of master games to see what looks good and what you should be doing is a necessary part of getting better, but that doesn't mean that occasionally studying an amateur game might not be very helpful. So here, this game was played earlier this year in the Marshall Club in New York. It's their FIDE under 1800 section. I think both players here are in the B category. So let's look at the game. Black sent me the game and he was the loser, and when you send me games for our video series you don't have to send me annotations, but he did. So one of the things I'd like to do is share his thoughts with you during the game and add my comments to that, and maybe we can learn even more from looking them both together. Alright, so white played d4, black played knight f6, white played knight f3. Okay, so black was planning to play a Benko gambit. Now normally with a Benko gambit, white plays c4, black plays c5, white plays d5, black plays b5. By playing knight f3 first, if black plays c5, white has more options as to what he might want to do. But still, you could play c5, and of course if white plays d5 and black plays either g6 or d6 and white plays c4, you could still play a Benko gambit with b5. So instead, black reaches out and he plays e6. And he says, I hadn't played in a couple years, I was rusty. I was going to play the Benko gambit and I reached out and touched the e-pawn. I see that a lot in lower rated players. They reach out in the opening and they make, quote, automatic moves, and then they realize that's not the move I wanted to play. You almost never see that from really high rated players. You know, they play the opening just as fast, but they're very careful. They know every move could be the move that causes the difference in the game. And, you know, in their brain, they kind of double check, is this really what I want to do? Even if they're playing it relatively quickly. And of course, you're writing down the moves, which give you an extra few seconds to think about what you want to do. But, you know, if you're one of those people who makes this kind of mistake, you know, don't reach out too fast. In this case, of course, e6 is a perfectly good move. It's just not what black was planning to play. So white plays e3, black plays d5, white plays bishop d3, the Cole system. And here the main line is to play c5, and black writes in his notes, his c5 is the thematic move. I was playing very safe and non-committal moves because of my nerves from not having played for a while. So he gives the line with c5. Okay, so white plays knight bd2, black castles, and white plays b3, which is the Cole-Zukertort system. And now again, c5 is the major move here. Black decides to play a little too solid with c6. Now he's going to be a little cramped. This kind of, you know, pawn structure is very common in the semi-Slav, but against the Steinitz-Zukertort, it's nothing special. Okay, white plays bishop to b2, black plays b6, white castles, and black plays the thematic bishop a6. The idea is when you have all these pawns on light squares, it makes the light squared bishop bad. So leaving the knight on b8 and using it to guard your bishop on a6 to trade off the light squared bishops is a major idea in these kind of openings. All right, let me turn on the engine here. So white plays c4, number one move. Black plays knight bd7, and white plays knight e5. And whenever your opponent does something like that, you have to ask yourself, do I want to take, or do I want to just move my knight on f6 and then play f6 and get rid of that knight? Now right now you can't move the knight on f6 because the knight is threatening c6. So you either have to take the knight on e5 or guard c6. And the computer says it's close. The computer says bishop b7 is a good move to guard c6, or you can take the knight. the person who sent me the game said, I do not like positions where white has knights at e5 and f3, so I wanted to take this knight as quickly as possible before he could play f4 or knight f3. All right, so he plays knight takes e5, a reasonable move. D takes e5, knight d7 hitting the pawn. And white plays queen to e2. Computer says maybe c2 is a little better. All right, and black plays d takes c5. Computer says the best move is either f5 or knight c5 hitting the bishop. And now basically black says he wants to trade off this knight before he can possibly go up to the d6 square. So white plays bishop c4, and now white miscalculates. He calculates b5, bishop c4, knight c5, bishop back, b4, winning the exchange, missing the fact that the knight can go to c4 in that line. Let's show it. b5, bishop d3, knight c5, bishop c2, b4, missing knight c4. That's what he missed. And he says this was a retained image error because he retained the image of the pawn here and didn't think the knight could go to c4. But of course, pushing the pawn to open the line would allow the knight to go to c4. All right, so back to the game. After he played b5, white, of course, played bishop d3 anyway. Black went ahead and played knight c5, which is as good as anything. And now white calculates a counting sequence, which is, complicated, but he doesn't need to do that. The simplest move here is the best one. Just play bishop to c2 and save the bishop. Keep it simple. Instead, he counterattacks with bishop to a3. And the Stockfish says he loses about a whole pawn in evaluation this way. It's not that he's losing material, it's just that he's throwing away his advantage by doing this. So black plays knight takes d3. White plays bishop takes e7, and now the queen is overworked. He can't guard the knight and take the bishop. So he takes the bishop. White takes here. And now black, of course, should attack the queen with one of the rooks. The problem is that he took 4 minutes to do that. And this is one of the themes of this game was they're playing a game at about 40-2, so you have about 3 minutes a move. But just because you have 3 minutes a move doesn't mean you should take 3 minutes on every move. In fact, on moves like this where white's not threatening anything and it's obvious you want to get those rooks in the game, then taking more than a minute and a half or so is just kind of silly. So here black plays rook fd8, and black correctly notes in his annotations to the game, I was taking way too long. I just kept thinking about how to keep the knight out of d6. So white plays queen to c2, hitting the pawn on c7, and here black notes that his computer annotation shows that queen c7 is equal. It is. The computer also says playing b4 to open up the bishop's line is also equal. Instead, he plays bishop back to b7. And now white gets a big advantage because the knight's going to be coming in. Now, the only way to undermine that would be to play f6 at some point, which is going to be a little bit of a concession. So black plays rook to d5 and hits the e-pawn. And white correctly plays f4. And black plays f6. He has nothing better. And now what white should do is kind of switch away from this d6 square and start looking at the king side. With this rook on d5 not in the defense of the king side, he could play something like pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And now try to get some pieces up on the king side. The computer says the first move you should play here is b4, clamping down on that bishop on the queen side. That's not an easy move to see because obviously he can't play queen takes b4 because of knight f6 check. But white, instead of going for the king side, plays rook a to d1. And that lets black capture on e5, and now black's problems are pretty much all done with that doubling and isolating of the pawns. So black correctly, well, he should take the pawn first before he resolves anything. He should play f takes e5 right away. Instead, he plays rook a d8, but that gives white a chance to either take here or maybe even play knight to d6. So that's also inaccurate. Okay, so white plays rook to d5. Rook takes d5. And the engine says it's best to recapture e takes d5, and on knight d6 maybe play b4. Instead, black recaptures with the rook, attacking the e-pawn again. And again, white should switch to this kingside play with e takes f6 with a big advantage. White plays rook to d1, allowing his pawns to get messed up instead. Makes a big difference. F takes e5, f takes e5. And, oh, sorry. White saw that if he recaptures, black will just take. So white plays the Zwischenzug, knight g5, threatening queen takes h7 check, king f8, and then queen h8 checkmate. So black has to stop it. Well, whenever someone's threatening checkmate, you should ask yourself, what are all the moves to stop checkmate? Well, let's see if we can find them. The rook can go to d3, blocking the diagonal. Rook can take on d1 check. The pawn can go to e4, blocking the diagonal. Black could play g6, blocking the diagonal. Black cannot play h6 because of queen h7 check, queen h8 mate. He could play queen takes g5, giving up the queen. Would, of course, a silly way to stop it. So once you get that entire list, you can cross off a lot of the moves like rook to d3 and queen takes g5. But it turns out, you know, why not take the rook and get with check and get the queen off the diagonal? Here's what black wrote. He says, black is playing too quickly to try to make up time. He's only got 31 minutes left now to make another 17 moves. So he's starting to hurry to make up. And you should make up time if you can, but not on critical moves. So here he said, I thought I had to stop the mate, and this is the only way. I never even looked at my checks. He says, I should have played rook takes d1 check, queen takes d1, e takes f4, e takes f4, h6, and black has a clear advantage being up a pawn. So by instead playing g6, this gives white time to take back on e5. So white plays rook to e1 is best move. And black plays c5, opening his bishop. And white plays e4, driving the rook away from the guarding of the e-pawn. And here he said, I should have played either rook d7 or rook d8. It doesn't make that much difference. He tried to figure out if there was a difference. And instead, he took about 5 minutes to make this move. So his clock went down from 26 minutes to 21 minutes on this move, just determining where to put the rook. And that's just, you know, a bad use of time. You don't want to do that. You always want to let your opponent, not let your opponent, but make your opponent beat you. Don't beat yourself. If you take too much time, you're going to beat yourself, and then anybody can beat you. I always kid my students, and I tell them that my wife, Shelly, can beat them if they take too much time. She can see that their flag falls, even if she doesn't really know how to play chess at all. So I've seen tremendous upsets where 14 and 1500 players lose to like 800 players, where they're completely outplaying the 800 player, but they're playing so slow that they get into ridiculous time pressure, and then they beat themselves. So you just never want that to happen. You don't want to beat yourself. You want to you want to make your opponent beat you. So here, by taking, you know, 5 minutes to play rook d7, black's just taking away his thinking time, which he might need critically in the next 14 moves or so. All right, so white plays queen to f2. And now black's got a pretty big advantage. If we look at the board, he's got 7 pawns to 6, and all his pieces are pretty good. So he should go about, you know, trying to take advantage of that. So how can he do it? Well, he could trade off his doubled isolated pawn and take on f4. That's perfectly reasonable. Stockfish says if you do that, that black's up by 2 pawns, and that's the second best move. So just hand waving here and just saying, if I take that pawn and he takes back, and I undouble my pawns, you don't want to just hand wave your moves in critical positions, but here white's not really threatening that much, so that's a reasonable move. The number one move here is to play c4 and get this 3-on-2 majority rolling, so these pawns can start coming down, and with the rook and the bishop affecting the queen side here, that extra pawn becoming a passed pawn is going to be a big deal. Instead, black is obsessing over this knight up here, but notice the knight's not really doing anything other than tying the queen down to the e-pawn. There's no threat absolutely to h7. It's guarded 3 times and only attacked once. But black weakens both the h-pawn by pushing it up one where it's not guarded anymore, and the g-pawn by playing h6, which allows white to get some targets in the future. So he plays h6, and the computer says, well, black lost about half his advantage here. He was ahead by a little over 2 pawns. Now he's ahead by a little less than 1. So white quickly plays his knight back to f3, and black has 19.5 minutes to finish the next 13 moves. What does he do? He thinks for 7 out of the 19.5 minutes, and he simply puts his rook behind the potential passed pawn. Well, that's kind of a reasonable thing to do, but the computer says, hey, you can just take the pawn, and if white plays knight e5 with an attack on the pawn and an attack on the rook, just save the rook, and if he takes the pawn back, you can move your queen over and guard the square. All right, so we were looking at black taking the pawn, knight here, rook back. If white now plays knight takes g6 instead, then queen g5, and if knight takes f4, you can pin it with rook f8. If white guards it with g3, then of course e5 would win the knight. So there's various and sundry things that black can do, but that's hard to figure out when your time's short. I'm sure I would have missed that too, with short time there. So black plays rook to c7, and that kind of just gives up this pawn for nothing. So white says, thank you, thank you, thank you, and he takes off the pawn, and now he is threatening knight takes g6 for sure. So black has to figure out the best way to save it. The engine says that black should play g5 and save it that way, which is a little bit hard move to play because white can take and kind of open up your king. So it's understandable that black didn't want to do that, especially short on time. So he just plays queen to g6 and guards the pawn. And here white has a nice little advantage. He should probably either put his queen on the d file, queen to d2, or maybe play h4 and get his h-pawn into the game. He does move the h-pawn, but he only moves it up to h3, which is a defensive move, not really a defensive and offensive move. And the engine thinks he lost most of his advantage by doing that. Again, thinks black should play g5 here to push up the pawn. But that's not the kind of move humans would play when they're short on time. So black plays a more human move. He plays king to h7 and overprotects the g6 and h6 pawns. And white is kind of lacking for a plan here. He should probably reposition the knight up, play knight g4 with the idea of maybe e5 and knight f6 check with a big advantage. Instead, he kind of punts and plays king h2. It's amazing the difference. If he plays knight to g4, the engine thinks that white's advantage is like an entire pawn. And if he plays king h2, it's as if black now plays g5, that the game's about even. So that's a pretty big difference between white being on the verge of winning versus black being equal. But black in this case really doesn't know what to do, and g5 is the only move. I guess the engine that he used for this might not have been as good as Stockfish 10, because he says that he probably should have played c4. Let's take a look at that. c4. The computer says that's not the best. It says after c4, white can play b takes c4, b takes c4, knight to g4. And now if black plays, what can he play? If he plays h5, then queen h4, threatening knight f6 check can be played. It says, but black can play queen e7, knight f6 check, king g7, e5, c3 with some counterplay. Okay, interesting. All right, let's go back to the game. So in the game, black short on time. He's down to 12 minutes. He wants to keep moving fast. And he plays a6. And his note is, I'm not sure what this move actually does. I wanted to play c4 and keep the a pawn safe, but this is too defensive. So what he's worried about is he's worried about c4, b takes, queen takes a7. But if he does that, the computer says he can undermine the knight with g5, and that's okay. Again, a hard line to see. So that's why he played a6, to play c4 without losing the pawn. So white plays knight g4, and now black has to be very careful because white can easily play e5 and knight f6. He could also play queen to h4. So black's got to keep the king side solid. And the best way to do that here, well, the computer thinks a6 is a losing move. It says no matter what black plays here, white should win. Interesting, because he gives his next move a question mark and says it's a losing move. But Stockfish actually says he might be lost here. For instance, let's look at that move c4 now. c4, white could play just f5, blasting him open. E takes f5, e takes f5, rook f7, pinning the pawn, f6, hitting the queen, queen f8, queen to b6, guarding the pawn that way. And now black's in some trouble. For instance, suppose he tries to get rid of that knight with h5. Then knight e5, and the rook can't take the pawn because it has to guard the bishop, so that doesn't work. But knight e5 is a threat anyway. Let's say the bishop goes somewhere where it's safe, like bishop to a8. Then white can play rook e6, overprotect the pawn, and now he's threatening knight e5 again. And there's no defense now. So the person who sent me the game thought that maybe his move there was the losing move, but it's possible that a6 is the losing move. All right, so after knight to g4, black played queen d4, offering the trade of queens, and he said this is the losing move. He doesn't give analysis showing that other moves would have saved the game, but it looks like Stockfish thinks that he can't. And white just plays queen h4 with a double threat. He's threatening to play knight checks, and he's threatening to take on h6. For instance, there's no defense. If queen to g7, then simply knight f6 check, and if the king moves to h8, just knight e8, forking the rook and the queen, and there's all kinds of problems coming up here because the queen has to guard this diagonal anyway, and he has to guard the rook. It's just a big mess. So he can't play queen back to g7, but if he plays h5, which is what he played in the game, then knight f6 check, which is what was played, is winning because there's no moves here. For instance, suppose you play king g7, well then knight e8 check wins the rook. If he plays king h6, then queen g5 check, king here, knight check again wins the rook. The only other move which was played in the game was king to h8. And now white simply plays threatening queen to h6 check, rook h7, queen takes h7, mate. Okay, so black can't stop that. If he plays rook g7, then simply queen h6 is mate on the next move after rook h7. But what else can he do? So there's no defense here. So after queen g5, black said, please take my rook. Knight takes rook, at least I can fight a little bit more. White said, no, I'll just take the pawn and threaten to take the rook now. And as we just saw, it's going to be mate if he moves the rook. Rook g7, queen checks, rook here, queen takes mate. So after queen g6, threatening queen h7 mate, then black resigned. All right, let's go through the game real fast again just to see what happened here. So the game was back and forth. It was fairly well played on both sides. We have a Kohl-Zuckertort opening. Black tries to trade off his bad bishop. Takes the knight. Takes the pawn. Now he's got to be a little careful with these pawns not to get a bad bishop. Not the best move, bishop a3 for white. Black's taking too much time to play obvious moves. Now black should, play a move like maybe b4 or something like that. He plays bishop b7, passive. Now he attacks the e-pawn. White should take and go after some kingside attack. Instead, he just plays on the e-file. He plays the Zwischenzug. Black should take the rook. He doesn't. He plays there. Gives white a chance to consolidate. And now if black's clever about how he's playing here, he's going to be okay, but he's a little too cautious. He plays h6, creating weaknesses, and you saw how that hurt him later. Knight f3, threatening knight e5. He could still just take the pawn, and he's okay, but he didn't see that after knight e5, he could just give up the g-pawn with a good game. So instead, he loses the pawn. Black tries to guard it. White plays h3. King h7. White plays king h2. Not the best move. And now black should play something like g5. He plays a6, and after knight g4, white's winning. Queen d4, we agree with him, is not the best move, but it does deserve the question mark because it ends the game quickly by taking away the defense. Queen h4, h5, knight checks, king h8, queen g5, rook h7, queen g6. So let me read you what black said at the end of the game. Here's my 4 lessons from this game. It's a good idea to ask yourself, what did I learn from this game for the future? 1, I played too slowly on non-consequential moves, or as I like to call them, non-critical moves. And if you don't know what that means, you can see yesterday's video where I talk about what's a critical move, critical decisions. He said I was playing too defensive when I could have created counterplay. He said the break move c5 was necessary. He says sometimes you just have to worry about making your pieces good and not just making your opponent's pieces bad. And finally, when your king is being attacked, do not remove pieces from that area until you have determined that the area is really safe. I think those are good lessons. Hopefully you'll learn from them too. If you enjoyed our videos, you can subscribe to the channel. We're going to throw in amateur games once in a while. If you do want to send me an amateur game, go to my website, danheisman.com, and email me the game. You don't have to annotate it. Don't enclose it in PGN notation or anything like that. Just copy and paste the text of the moves into the email message and just send the moves, and I can enter them into my library and play them out for the videos. I won't use every game that's sent to me, but I try to use a lot of them. Alright, hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. This is Dan Heisman for our YouTube series. We'll see you next time. Thanks.